The lecture hall was packed that Monday morning. Students chatted quietly as they settled into their seats, notebooks open and calculators ready. Advanced Calculus with Professor Whitmore was known as one of the toughest courses on campus, and everyone wanted to make a good first impression. The professor himself stood at the front of the room, a tall man with gray hair and glasses perched on the end of his nose. He wore an expensive-looking tweed jacket with leather patches on the elbows, the kind that screamed, "I've been teaching longer than you've been alive." At exactly 9:00 a.m., he cleared his throat loudly, and the room fell silent. "Welcome to Advanced Calculus," he began, writing his name on the board with precise chalk strokes. "I don't tolerate lateness, phones, or excuses. If you can't handle that, the door is right there." He pointed without looking up from the syllabus he was now distributing to the first row of students. 10 minutes into Professor Whitmore's speech about academic excellence and his own impressive credentials, the lecture hall door creaked open. Every head in the room turned to look. A young black man with close-cropped hair stood in the doorway. He wore simple jeans, clean but clearly worn at the knees, and a plain navy hoodie. A battered backpack hung from one shoulder. He hesitated for just a moment as he felt all eyes on him, then quietly made his way toward one of the few empty seats in the back row. Professor Whitmore stopped mid-sentence, his chalk hovering over the equation he'd begun to write. The silence in the room grew heavy as he turned around slowly, making a show of checking his watch. "I suppose," he said, voice dripping with sarcasm, "some students believe their time is more valuable than everyone else's." A few students near the front snickered. Others looked down at their desks, uncomfortable with the sudden tension. The late arrival simply nodded once in acknowledgement of the comment, pulled out a notebook, and began writing. "Name?" Professor Whitmore demanded, crossing his arms. "Andrew Taylor," the student replied, his voice calm and measured. "Well, Mr. Taylor, at this university, and especially in my classroom, we value punctuality. Perhaps wherever you came from, showing up whenever you felt like it was acceptable, but not here." Andrew's expression remained neutral, though something flickered briefly in his eyes. He didn't respond to the professor's comment, just nodded again and continued setting up his materials. "Now that we've all decided to join us," the professor continued with a pointed look at Andrew, "let's see what you remember from Calculus IO." As Professor Whitmore launched into a rapid-fire review session, calling on students randomly, the tension in the room remained. Many students struggled to answer his increasingly difficult questions, fumbling through half-remembered formulas as sweat beaded on their foreheads. "Mr. Taylor," the professor finally called, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Since you felt comfortable enough to arrive late to my class, perhaps you're also comfortable explaining to us how to solve this integral." He wrote a complex equation on the board, more difficult than any he had given the other students. A few people exchanged glances, recognizing the unfairness of the situation. Andrew looked at the board for a moment, his face still unreadable. Then, without referring to his notes, he gave a concise, perfectly articulated answer. The professor's smile faltered slightly. "Correct," he said after a pause, sounding almost disappointed. "Though next time, show your work." As the class continued, Andrew remained quiet, taking detailed notes but not volunteering any information. What no one in that room realized was that the notebook he was writing in contained not just the basic calculus the professor was reviewing, but complex mathematical theories and original proofs that would have astonished everyone present. When class ended, Professor Whitmore announced the first assignment due next week. A problem set that made several students groan. As Andrew packed up his things, the professor watched him with narrowed eyes, already planning how to test this late-arriving student who had answered his challenge too easily for comfort. Little did the professor know what he was up against. 3 weeks had passed since that first day, and Professor Whitmore's advanced calculus class had fallen into a predictable routine. The students now knew which seats to avoid, front row, center, if they didn't want to be called on, and which topics would trigger the professor's lengthy, self-important tangents about his research. Andrew always arrived 5 minutes early now, choosing the same seat in the third row by the window. He kept to himself, speaking only when spoken to, his notebooks filled with neat, precise handwriting. A few classmates had tried to start study groups with him, noticing how easily he completed the problem sets, but he politely declined each time, explaining he worked nights at the campus coffee shop and the library. What they didn't know was that Andrew didn't need study partners. Math had been his companion since childhood, a private language he'd learned from his grandfather, who had worked as a mathematician at a research lab during a time when black men with PhDs were often mistaken for janitors. Today, the classroom felt particularly tense. Midterms were approaching, and Professor Whitmore seemed determined to remind everyone just how difficult his exams would be. "I've never given an A+ on a midterm," he announced with something close to pride as he paced the front of the room. "I doubt this year will be different." He turned to the whiteboard and wrote out a complex multivariable calculus problem, the kind with nested integrals and tricky substitutions that made most students' eyes glaze over. "Let's see who's been paying attention," Professor Whitmore said, scanning the room like a hawk looking for its prey. His eyes settled on Andra, who was quietly working through a different problem in his notebook. "Mr. Taylor," he called, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. "Perhaps you can enlighten us? Assuming you've been paying attention rather than daydreaming." The room went silent. Everyone knew what was happening. For weeks now, the professor had been calling on Andra whenever the most difficult problems came up, as if determined to find the limits of his knowledge. So far, Andra had given correct but minimal answers, never showing more understanding than necessary to satisfy the question. Andra closed his notebook and walked to the front of the room. The whiteboard marker felt light in his hand as he studied the problem. It was challenging, but nothing compared to the work he did late at night, when his roommate was asleep and he could lose himself in the mathematical questions that truly fascinated him. For a moment, he considered showing what he really knew, writing out not just the standard solution, but the elegant approach he developed that could solve entire classes of similar problems. His grandfather's voice echoed in his head. "Choose your moments carefully. The world isn't always ready to see us shine." Instead, Andra worked through the problem methodically, using the techniques the professor had taught in class. His handwriting was steady, his steps clear. "And that gives us the final answer of 2p/3, he concluded, capping the marker. Professor Whitmore frowned slightly, clearly disappointed at not finding a mistake. "Correct, though your approach was unnecessarily complicated. You could have used cylindrical coordinates from the start." Andrew nodded and returned to his seat. A student named Lily gave him a subtle thumbs up as he passed her desk. After class, as students filed out, Professor Whitmore called Andrew to stay behind. "You have some facility with calculus," the professor said, straightening papers on his desk rather than looking at Andrew directly. "But I wonder if you truly understand the underlying concepts. Memorizing steps will only get you so far in advanced mathematics." Andrew stood quietly, his backpack strapped tight in his grip. "The midterm will separate those who can follow recipes from those with real mathematical insight," the professor continued. "I suggest you prepare accordingly." "Yes, sir," Andrew replied, his voice giving away nothing of the frustration building inside him. That evening, alone in the cramped apartment he shared with a nursing student he rarely saw, Andrew pulled out a worn photo of his grandfather standing proudly in a lab coat. Below it, he placed the letter he'd received last week, an acceptance from a prestigious mathematics journal for a paper he'd submitted under a pseudonym. "Not yet," he whispered to himself, tucking both items back into his desk drawer. But soon. The midterm was in 2 days. Professor Whitmore had no idea what was coming. The small apartment was quiet except for the soft scratching of pencil on paper. It was almost midnight, but Andrew showed no signs of tiredness as he worked at his desk, a single lamp casting a warm glow over his calculations. The walls of his bedroom told a story that no one at the university had been allowed to see. Every inch was covered with papers, formulas, and diagrams, some yellowing with age, others fresh from last week's late-night inspiration. Andrew paused to rub his eyes, then glanced at the framed photo on his desk, his grandfather in a lab coat standing next to a massive early computer, pride shining in his eyes despite the challenges he had faced. Next to the photo lay 2 published papers from the Journal of Mathematics Research, both bearing the name A.G. Wilson, the pseudonym Andrew used for his work. His phone buzzed with a text from his boss at the coffee shop. "Can you cover tomorrow morning? Luis is sick." Andrew sighed but replied yes. The extra hours would help with rent, even if it meant less sleep before the midterm. He was working 2 jobs, mornings at the coffee shop and evenings shelving books at the library, just to afford tuition and this tiny apartment with its paper-thin walls. He turned back to the complex differential equation he'd been developing. This wasn't homework or exam prep. This was his real work, the mathematics that challenged and fulfilled him. What Professor Whitmore taught in class was elementary compared to the theories Andrew explored at night. His grandfather had recognized Andrew's gift when he was just 7 years old, finding him drawing perfect geometric shapes and solving multiplication problems for fun. Where others might have pushed a child prodigy into the spotlight, Grandpa Thomas had taken a different approach. "The world doesn't always know what to do with people like us," he told Andra, after an elementary school teacher had accused him of cheating on a math test. "Sometimes it's wiser to keep your light hidden until you're in a place where it can truly shine." Andra had taken those words to heart, especially after watching how his grandfather, despite his brilliance, had been relegated to checking other people's work rather than leading research projects. By high school, Andrew was already solving college-level problems, but he learned to give just enough correct answers to get good grades without drawing too much attention. Now in college, he published his real work under a pseudonym, building a reputation in mathematical circles that none of his professors knew about. 2 nights ago, he'd received an email from Dr. Chen, a leading mathematician at MIT, praising A.G. Wilson's innovative approach to chaos theory. Andrew set down his pencil and stretched. His tiny desk was covered with notebooks, each one color-coded for different projects. The red notebook contained his class notes and assignments, deliberately simplified to meet expectations without exceeding them. The blue notebooks, he had filled 3 already, held his real work, the mathematics that sometimes kept him up until dawn because he couldn't bear to leave a problem unsolved. Tomorrow was the midterm exam. Andra had already looked through his textbook, identifying exactly what level of understanding Professor Whitmore would expect. He had carefully practiced solving problems the way the professor had demonstrated, even though he knew more elegant approaches. "Just get through this semester," he reminded himself, closing his books for the night. "Then you can apply for the research scholarship." The prestigious Wilson Fellowship, ironically named given his pseudonym, would give him the freedom to do mathematics without hiding his abilities. As he got ready for bed, Andrew thought about his classmates, how they stressed over formulas and concepts that came as naturally to him as breathing. He sometimes felt guilty for not helping them more, but getting too involved would mean revealing his true abilities. His alarm was set for 5:00 a.m. for his coffee shop shift. After work, he'd head straight to Professor Whitmore's midterm. Little did the professor know that the quiet student he seemed determined to humiliate had already solved mathematical problems that Whitmore himself would struggle to understand. Andrew turned off the light, the moonlight illuminating the equations that covered his walls like the secret language of a hidden world, a world where he didn't have to pretend to be less than he was. The midterm exam papers were handed back exactly 1 week after the test. Professor Whitmore made a show of it, arranging them in order from lowest to highest score before distributing them to the anxious students. "Disappointing, as usual," he announced to the class. "Though I suppose I shouldn't expect brilliance from everyone." Andrew sat quietly, watching his classmates receive their papers. Some looked relieved, others crushed. Lily, who sat 2 rows ahead, smiled at her B+, while Thomas, the football player who had been struggling all semester, stared at his D with slumped shoulders. When Professor Whitmore reached Andrew's desk, he paused, holding the paper just out of reach. "Mr. Taylor," he said, his voice carrying through the quiet classroom, "your paper was interesting." Andrew felt his heartbeat quicken, but kept his expression neutral. He had stuck to the plan, solving the regular problems with the exact approaches shown in class. But then, on the last page, there had been that bonus question, a problem so complex that Professor Whitmore had called it likely impossible within the time constraints, but worth attempting for those who think themselves exceptional. It was a problem related to Andrew's own research, a question about optimizing paths through multi-dimensional space. Without thinking, he had solved it completely, providing not just 1 but 2 different approaches. Only after turning in his exam had he realized his mistake. "Thank you, sir," Andrew said, reaching for his paper. The professor pulled it back slightly. "I've never seen someone cheat quite so boldly in my class before." The room went silent. Every eye turned toward them. "Excuse me," Andrew said, his voice steady despite the anger flaring in his chest. "This bonus problem," Professor Whitmore said, tapping the last page, "is one I've been working on myself for several months. There's simply no way you solved it legitimately in a 30-minute exam period." Andrew felt a familiar weight settle on his shoulders, the same weight he'd felt when his 8th grade teacher had accused him of copying answers for the math competition, when his high school counselor suggested he take more appropriate courses instead of advanced placement, when the coffee shop manager always asked him to double-check his register despite never making mistakes. "I didn't cheat," Andrew said quietly. "Then perhaps you can explain how you managed to produce a solution that experienced mathematicians would find challenging, much less provide two different approaches." The professor's voice tripped with disbelief. "There's simply no way someone like you could solve this problem." "Someone like you?" The words hung in the air, their meaning clear to everyone in the room. A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others stared at their desks, unwilling to witness the confrontation. Years of holding back, of hiding his abilities, of playing small to make others comfortable, something finally broke inside Andrew. He stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor in the silent classroom. "Someone like me, Professor?" Andrew asked, his voice stronger now. "Would you care to elaborate on what exactly you mean by that?" Professor Whitmore blinked, momentarily thrown by the direct challenge. "I meant a student who barely participates, who gives minimal answers, who shows no particular insight during lectures." "Or did you mean something else?" Andrew pressed, looking the professor directly in the eyes. A flush crept up Professor Whitmore's neck. Several students were recording the exchange on their phones now, sensing something significant was happening. "I simply find it impossible to believe that you solved this independently," the professor said, regaining his composure. "The statistical probability." "Then test me," Andrew interrupted. "Right now. Give me another problem, one you haven't solved yourself yet. Let's see what happens." The challenge hung in the air between them. For a moment, Professor Whitmore looked like he might dismiss the class instead. Then, his academic pride taking over, he nodded curtly. "Very well, Mr. Taylor. Let's see what you're really capable of." He turned toward the whiteboard, marker in hand, a small smile playing at his lips as he prepared to put this presumptuous student in his place once and for all. The classroom held its collective breath as the showdown began. Professor Whitmore took his time at the whiteboard, uncapping the marker with deliberate slowness. The classroom remained completely silent. No one moved, no one whispered. Even those who had been packing up their bags froze in place, sensing they were about to witness something important. "Since you're so confident," the professor said, beginning to write on the board, "let's try something from my current research." His hand moved quickly across the whiteboard, filling it with a complex equation involving multiple integrals and what looked like elements of both topology and number theory. When he finished, he stepped back with a satisfied expression. "This is a problem I've been working on for a forthcoming paper," he explained, turning to face Andrew. "Take your time. Or perhaps you'd like to admit now that—" "May I?" Andrew interrupted, gesturing toward the board. A flicker of surprise crossed the professor's face, but he handed over the marker and stepped aside, arms crossed over his chest. A few students exchanged glances. One guy in the front row discreetly adjusted his phone to better record what was happening. Andrew approached the board calmly, studying the problem for a full minute in silence. Something had changed in his demeanor. The reserved student who had spent weeks giving minimal answers was gone. In his place stood someone fully present, fully engaged, with a confidence that seemed to radiate from within. He began to write, his marker moving steadily across the board. Unlike his previous answers in class, he wasn't just solving the problem, he was explaining his thought process as he went, pointing out connections and implications that weren't immediately obvious. "If we approach this from a standard analysis perspective, we get stuck here," he said, circling a particular section of the equation. "But if we consider a geometric interpretation instead—" 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Andrew filled the first board, then moved to the second. Professor Whitmore's expression shifted from smugness to confusion, then to something that looked almost like alarm. A few of the more advanced students in the class began nodding along, recognizing the brilliance of what they were seeing. This relates to Thurston's geometrization conjecture, Andrew explained at one point, referencing a famously difficult mathematical concept that was well beyond the scope of their course. But we can simplify it for our purposes using this approach. After 35 minutes, Andrew set down the marker and turned to face the class. That gives us the general solution framework, he concluded. There are probably refinements possible, but this demonstrates the main idea. The room was completely still. Then someone in the back began to clap. Others joined in until most of the class was applauding. A few students looked confused. They hadn't followed the complex math, but they understood enough to know they had witnessed something extraordinary. Professor Whitmore stared at the boards, his face unreadable. He walked slowly along the length of Andrew's solution, examining the work step by step. The class waited for his reaction. He began, then stopped, clearing his throat. This is not at all how I would have approached the problem. No, Andrew agreed calmly. Your published papers suggest you would have used a variational approach. That would work too, but it would require significantly more computational steps. The professor's head snapped up. You've read my papers? All of them, Andrew confirmed, including your early work on bounded cohomology, which I found particularly interesting, though I think your third lemma had a small error in the boundary case. Someone in the class whispered, "Oh snap," and a few nervous laughs broke the tension. Who are you? Professor Whitmore asked, his voice barely audible. Andrew took a deep breath. I'm the student you've been trying to humiliate all semester. I'm also A.G. Wilson, whose paper on topological constraints in dynamic systems was cited in last month's American Mathematical Monthly. Gasps and whispers erupted around the room. Everyone knew that journal. It was one of the most prestigious in the field. That's not possible, the professor stammered. A.G. Wilson is. Me, Andrew said simply. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a folder with his published papers and the correspondence from journal editors. I've been publishing under a pseudonym since my first year of college. As Professor Whitmore flipped through the papers with shaking hands, one of the students stood up. I knew it, he exclaimed. I kept thinking your handwriting on the board looked familiar. My graduate student brother has one of your proofs pinned above his desk. Phones were out everywhere now, recording the moment when a quiet student revealed himself to be one of the rising stars in mathematics, right in front of the professor who had tried so hard to put him down. Word traveled fast across the university campus. By lunchtime, video clips of Andrew's mathematical showdown with Professor Whitmore had spread to every department. Students who had never set foot in a calculus classroom were talking about the quiet guy who had stood up to the notoriously difficult professor. Andrew tried to keep a low profile, heading to his shift at the library right after class, but people kept stopping him, offering congratulations or simply staring in recognition. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from classmates and even students he'd never met. 2 days later, Andrew was shelving books in the reference section when his phone rang with an unknown number. Hello, this is Andrew, he answered quietly, mindful of the library's silence policy that he usually enforced. Mr. Taylor, this is Dr. Rivera, chair of the mathematics department. The woman's voice was crisp and professional. I'd like to meet with you tomorrow at 10 a.m. in my office. Professor Whitmore will be joining us. Andrew's stomach tightened. Despite the positive reactions from students, he worried about potential consequences. Would the professor find some way to punish him for the public challenge? Yes, Dr. Rivera. I'll be there, he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. The department chair's office was larger than Andrew expected, with walls lined with mathematical texts and framed diplomas. Dr. Rivera, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun, gestured for Andrew to take a seat. Professor Whitmore was already there, looking uncomfortable in a chair across from the large desk. Thank you for coming, Mr. Taylor, Dr. Rivera began, her expression serious but not unkind. Or should I say, Mr. Wilson, I've spent the past day reviewing your published work. It's quite remarkable. Thank you, Andrew said simply, unsure where this conversation was heading. I've also watched several videos of what occurred in Professor Whitmore's class. She glanced briefly at the professor, whose eyes remained fixed on the floor. And I've received emails from 12 different students in that class, all describing a pattern of behavior that concerns me greatly. Andrew sat quietly, waiting. Professor Whitmore and I have had a lengthy discussion about appropriate pedagogical approaches and the university's commitment to fostering talent in all our students. Her emphasis on all made her meaning clear. He has something he would like to say to you. Professor Whitmore finally looked up, his face drawn. The confident, domineering presence from the classroom had vanished. He looked older somehow, diminished. Mr. Taylor, he began, then cleared his throat. I behaved unprofessionally and made assumptions about your abilities based on factors that had nothing to do with your mathematical talent. My conduct was inexcusable, and I sincerely apologize. Andrew nodded, processing the apology that seemed both practiced and uncomfortable. Furthermore, Dr. Rivera continued, this incident has prompted a broader review of our departmental culture. You're not the first student to experience this kind of treatment, though you may be the first with a mathematical background to so thoroughly disprove the assumptions made about you. She opened a folder on her desk, revealing several letters from former students, many of them minorities who had switched majors or transferred after taking Professor Whitmore's classes. I had no idea, Andrew said softly, reading the first few lines of one letter that described experiences painfully similar to his own. Few people complained officially, Dr. Rivera explained. Most simply disappeared from the program. We've been losing talented mathematicians for years without realizing why. She closed the folder and leaned forward. The university is forming a special committee to address these issues across all STEM departments, and we'd like you to be involved, if you're willing. Andrew looked up in surprise. Me? Yes, your perspective would be invaluable. And there's something else. She pushed a different folder toward him. The Wilson Fellowship for Mathematics Research. It's typically reserved for graduate students, but the committee has reviewed your published work and would like to make an exception. Andrew opened the folder with shaking hands. The fellowship would provide full funding for his remaining undergraduate years plus graduate studies, along with a stipend that meant he could quit his part-time jobs and focus entirely on mathematics. This isn't charity, Dr. Rivera said firmly, as if reading his thoughts. This is the university finally recognizing merit where it exists. Your work deserves support. As the meaning of her words sank in, Andrew felt a weight lifting from his shoulders, the heavy burden of hiding his abilities, of constantly diminishing himself to avoid scrutiny and prejudice. For the first time in years, he could simply be himself, a mathematician with ideas to explore and contributions to make. Professor Whitmore shifted in his chair, looking both chastened and, surprisingly, relieved, as if being forced to confront his biases had freed him from something as well. 6 months later, Andrew stood at a podium in the Grand Hall of the National Mathematics Conference, adjusting the microphone as he prepared to present his latest research. The room was packed with professors, researchers, and students from universities across the country. In the front row sat his grandfather, eyes bright with pride, his hands resting on a walking cane. Beside him was Dr. Rivera, who had personally nominated Andrew's paper for the conference's spotlight presentation slot, usually reserved for established researchers. Andrew glanced down at his notes one last time. So much had changed since that day in Professor Whitmore's classroom. The Wilson Fellowship had transformed his daily life. No more early morning coffee shop shifts or late nights shelving books. Instead, he had his own small office in the mathematics building, complete with a whiteboard that he could fill with equations without worrying about hiding them. Good afternoon, he began, his voice steady and confident. Today, I'll be discussing new approaches to solving multi-dimensional optimization problems with applications in artificial intelligence. As he moved through his presentation, explaining complex concepts in clear, accessible terms, Andrew spotted Professor Whitmore slipping into the back of the hall. The professor looked different, humbler somehow, less rigid in his posture. He had been required to complete the university's new sensitivity training program, developed partly in response to what had happened in his classroom. Andrew continued his presentation, fielding questions with ease, building on ideas suggested by the audience. This was what he loved most, the back and forth of mathematical discussion, the collective effort to push understanding forward. No pretending, no hiding. When the presentation ended, the applause was enthusiastic. Several university representatives approached Andrew immediately, handing him business cards, offering research positions and graduate scholarships. A young woman from his former calculus class, now considering a math major herself, waited patiently to congratulate him. As the crowd thinned, Professor Whitmore made his way forward. He looked nervous, adjusting his glasses repeatedly as he approached. "That was extraordinary work," he said quietly. "Your approach to the boundary conditions problem, I've never seen anything like it." "Thank you," Andrew replied, noticing how different this interaction felt compared to their classroom encounters. The professor hesitated, clearly uncomfortable but pressing on. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since everything happened. Your work has changed how I see mathematics and how I see my own biases." Andrew nodded, recognizing the difficulty of this admission. "I have so many brilliant students I never truly saw," the professor continued. "I'm trying to change that now." "That's good to hear," Andrew said. He wasn't ready to forgive everything, but he recognized genuine effort when he saw it. A month later, Andrew sat in Dr. Rivera's office, discussing a new initiative they were developing together. On her desk lay a proposal for a Taylor Scholarship for underrepresented students in STEM fields, named in honor of Andrew's grandfather. "The first scholarships will be awarded next semester," Dr. Rivera explained, showing Andrew the application materials. "We've already received funding commitments from 3 major technology companies." Andrew smiled, thinking about all the students like him who had walked away from math and science because they'd been made to feel they didn't belong. This scholarship wouldn't fix everything, but it was a start. That evening, he visited his old high school, where he'd been invited to speak to the math club. 20 students listened intently as he shared his story, not just his mathematical breakthroughs, but the challenges he'd faced and overcome. "Don't let anyone define your limits," he told them, looking especially at the few black and brown faces in the group. "And if someone underestimates you, prove them wrong. Not because you need their approval, but because the world needs your ideas." After the talk, a quiet boy approached him shyly. "I'm good at math," he said, "but my teacher keeps putting me in the slower group." Andrew nodded, understanding immediately. "Bring me something you're working on. We'll meet next week." As he walked to his car, Andrew thought about how different things might have been if his grandfather hadn't recognized and nurtured his talent. Now he had the chance to do that for others, to be the mentor he had been fortunate enough to have. His phone buzzed with a notification. Another mathematics journal accepting his latest paper. But it wasn't the acceptance that made him smile. It was the author name on the paper, Andrew Taylor. No more pseudonyms, no more hiding. Just his work, his ideas, and his real name for the world to see.